Jack Harris sat back in the plush chair, cradling a warm cup of coffee as he gazed out the window of his parents' home. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows on the neatly manicured lawns. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to slow down, where the soft chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves were the only sounds filling the air. Jack had been looking forward to this peaceful break for weeks. After months of high-stakes investigations, undercover operations, and constant danger, all he wanted was a few days to unwind. No criminals, no high-pressure cases, just a quiet time to relax and catch up with his family. But as he sipped his coffee and let out a long, contented sigh, the tranquility was suddenly shattered by the flashing of red and blue lights that bounced off the windows. His heart skipped a beat as the police sirens grew louder, and a voice blared over a loudspeaker, cutting through the stillness of the night, "Come out with your hands up." Jack's brow furrowed as he blinked, wondering if he was hearing things. His first instinct was to check the street outside, and when he pulled back the blinds, the sight that greeted him made his stomach drop. At least 4 police officers had their weapons drawn, aiming directly at his black SUV parked in the driveway. Confusion washed over him. Was this a mistake? Maybe the officers were after someone else, but the closer they got, the clearer it became. From the corner of his eye, Jack saw her, the unmistakable figure of Karen, the self-appointed neighborhood watch leader, standing across the street with a smug expression plastered on her face. "I told you I knew it, he's a criminal," she screamed, loud enough for the entire block to hear. Jack sighed deeply. This was not the vacation he had imagined. Jack stood frozen for a moment, still processing the absurdity of the situation. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had just come home to relax and enjoy a few days off, and now he was staring down the barrel of several police weapons. He looked down at his pajamas, then back at the officers, all aiming their guns at his vehicle. He rubbed his face in disbelief, trying to figure out how this went from zero to a full-blown standoff. Slowly, he stepped outside onto the porch, hands raised in mock surrender. His mind was screaming at him to just go back inside, but the situation had escalated too quickly to back out now. "This is a joke, right?" Jack muttered, already feeling the weight of the absurdity pressing down on him. "Sir, stay where you are," one officer shouted, his voice stern but shaky. Another officer barked, "Identify yourself." Jack sighed, doing his best to resist the urge to roll his eyes. "I'd love to, but I'd rather not do it at gunpoint in my parents' front yard." Karen, standing across the street with her phone, was practically shaking with excitement. She was live-streaming the whole thing, her eyes wide as she held her phone up like she was filming an episode of some ridiculous reality show. "This is how you keep the community safe," she declared triumphantly, clearly relishing the moment. "If you see something, say something." Her voice rang with an almost manic intensity, as if she had been waiting for an opportunity like this her entire life. Jack stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. He couldn't decide if she was playing the part of an overzealous neighborhood watchdog or if she genuinely thought she was the star of her own crime show. "Karen, what the hell are you talking about?" he called out, his frustration starting to creep into his voice. "Don't play dumb, buddy," she yelled back, her voice carrying across the street. "That car has been sitting there all day. No plates, no permit, that's gang behavior." Jack blinked in disbelief. Was she serious? "Karen, it's a government-issued vehicle. It has plates." "No!" Karen shrieked, her eyes wide with conviction. "I checked. It's got one of those shady black plates, which means it's fake." Jack's face twisted in confusion. "Karen, those are federal plates because I work for the federal government." One of the officers exchanged a glance with another. The uncertainty in their eyes was clear. They were caught in the middle of something they didn't understand, and Karen was making it worse. The officer closest to Jack stepped forward, a little hesitant now. "Sir, Do you have any identification? With an almost painful calm, Jack reached into his hoodie pocket. He had expected this. He pulled out his FBI badge and ID, holding them up for the officers to see. Before Jack could finish speaking, Karen lunged forward like a hawk swooping in for its prey. She snatched the wallet from his hand and raised it above her head, holding it up like she had just caught a criminal red-handed. "Fake! Fake!" she shouted, the thrill in her voice undeniable. "I knew it. Arrest him." Jack's patience snapped. He wasn't used to dealing with this level of absurdity, especially not after the kinds of criminals he regularly handled. "Karen, give me back my ID," he barked, stepping toward her. But Karen wasn't done. She shook her head, her voice rising. "This is a felony. He's pretending to be a federal officer. Someone call Homeland Security." The officers, clearly embarrassed now, exchanged awkward glances. One of them, a younger cop, stepped forward to take the ID from Karen. He examined it carefully, his face turning pale as he processed the information. Chief, we may have a situation here," the officer stammered, his voice cracking. A moment later, the police chief, a tired-looking older man, arrived on the scene. He looked at Karen first, then at Jack's badge. The situation was quickly turning into a comedy of errors, but Jack didn't find it funny. The chief let out a heavy sigh. "Lower your weapons," he said, his voice laced with exasperation. The officers hesitated, but eventually, they holstered their guns, stepping back in awkward silence. Karen, however, was not finished. She stormed forward, her voice shrill. "What are you doing? He's a criminal." The chief's patience had clearly worn thin. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you just accused a federal agent of impersonating law enforcement. That's an actual felony." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "I don't believe you. He probably faked the badge well enough to fool you." Jack shook his head, genuinely stunned by the sheer gall of Karen. "Karen, do you really think I went through the trouble of forging an entire FBI identity just to park in your neighborhood?" She crossed her arms, her lips pursed in defiance. "Sounds like something a criminal would say." Jack inhaled deeply, wondering if he could legally arrest her for stupidity. The chief, who had clearly had enough, stepped in once again. "Agent Morrison, I sincerely apologize for this mix-up." Jack shrugged, unable to suppress a smirk. "No hard feelings, Chief. Just another day in the field." As the officers packed up to leave, Karen stood there, still fuming. "This isn't over," she yelled. "I'll take this to the mayor if I have to." Jack arched a brow. "The mayor of what? Your Facebook group?" Several officers stifled their laughter, and Karen's face flushed bright red. The chief crossed his arms and looked at her one last time. "Ma'am, I think you've caused enough trouble for one night." Karen huffed and stormed off, but not before leaving one final threat: "This isn't over. I'll get to the bottom of this." Jack couldn't help but chuckle as he watched her walk away. "Please don't. Your detective work is questionable at best." The next few days passed in a haze of frustration for Jack. He had hoped for a peaceful vacation, but instead, his life had been turned upside down by Karen and her obsessive need for control. As he sat on the porch, trying to collect his thoughts and salvage what little peace remained, he realized something troubling. This wasn't just a petty vendetta. Karen wasn't simply trying to get him in trouble, she was playing a much bigger game, one that involved manipulation, money, and power. Jack had been in law enforcement long enough to spot a scam when he saw one, and Karen's actions were starting to fit a pattern. He remembered the way she had been so quick to call in authorities over a seemingly innocent misunderstanding, and how easily she escalated the situation into something far more serious. It was clear to Jack that Karen had more than just a bone to pick with him, she was using her role in the neighborhood to wield power over the people around her. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jack began digging into Karen's activities within the neighborhood. He started by talking to a few of the residents who had been on the receiving end of Karen's attention in the past. It didn't take long for him to hear the rumors, the whispers of homeowners who had received excessive fines for ridiculous reasons or had been threatened with absurd violations. People spoke of lawn decorations deemed inappropriate, fences that were too high, or bushes that were too overgrown, all things that weren't even mentioned in any HOA guidelines. Yet, Karen was relentless in enforcing these imaginary rules, using the HOA as a tool to control anyone she deemed unworthy of living in her perfect neighborhood. As Jack continued his investigation, he began to piece together a disturbing picture. Karen had essentially created an informal HOA, one that existed purely to serve her own interests. She had been extorting money from her neighbors, threatening them with fines, and using the power she had as a self-appointed neighborhood watch leader to make their lives miserable unless they paid up. Jack learned that Karen was pocketing a portion of the fines that residents were forced to pay to avoid conflict. In many cases, these families were being bled dry, all in the name of maintaining some imagined sense of community standards. What disturbed Jack the most was that she was playing on the vulnerabilities of the residents. Karen had been isolating the most vulnerable, elderly couples, young families, and those who were new to the area. She would target them with threats of foreclosure, claiming that their homes were violating the HOA's invisible rules. With no legal backing and no formal registration of the HOA, Karen was free to make up the rules as she went along. And the worst part? No one had the guts to challenge her, terrified that they would be the next victim of her wrath. Jack knew he couldn't let this go on. As much as he had wanted to avoid stirring up more trouble, he had to stop Karen before she caused any more damage. He decided to confront her directly, this time armed with the evidence he had gathered from his investigation. It wasn't just about clearing his own name anymore. He had seen enough to know that Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a criminal running a scam that had already destroyed lives in this neighborhood. One afternoon, Jack approached Karen's house, his resolve hardening. He knocked on the door with purpose, his mind set on bringing everything into the light. When she opened the door, her usual smug expression was gone. Instead, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Jack didn't waste time. "I know what you've been doing," he said flatly, holding up a stack of papers with the names of residents who had paid the bogus fines. "You've been running a scam through the HOA, and I'm going to put an end to it." For the first time, Karen didn't have a quick response. She looked like she might say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "These people need to follow the rules. If they don't, they'll face the consequences." Jack didn't flinch. "There are no rules, Karen. You've made them up as you went along to extort money from people. You've been stealing from your neighbors for years." Her face reddened with anger, but Jack could see the fear starting to creep in. She knew he had her now. "You can't prove any of that," she spat, but it was clear she was losing control. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Jack said, taking a step closer. "The evidence is all here. And I'm not the only one who knows now. The rest of the neighborhood is starting to figure out what you've been up to. This stops now." Karen's eyes flashed with panic. "You can't do this. I've been in charge here for years. This is my neighborhood," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. Jack shook his head. "Not anymore, Karen. You've crossed a line, and now you're going to answer for it." As Jack walked away from her house, he felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. But he also knew that there was much more to be done. The damage she had done couldn't be undone in one conversation. There were still families to help, still lives to be repaired. And he wasn't done yet. But the bigger question lingered, how many more neighborhoods are out there, suffering under the grip of people like Karen? The answer was one Jack was determined to find. In the days following Jack's confrontation with Karen, he thought he could finally relax, assuming that the worst was over. Karen, humiliated and backed into a corner, would surely retreat and go quiet. But as he soon discovered, Karen was not the type to back down. Far from it. She had only been waiting for an opportunity to escalate things further, and now, she was more determined than ever to make Jack's life a living nightmare. The first signs of her retaliation came in the form of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Jack had been so focused on exposing Karen that he hadn't considered how deeply her influence ran in the neighborhood. Over the years, she had built a web of control, using intimidation and manipulation to keep everyone in line. And now, Karen was using her position to turn the entire community against him. Jack was walking to his car one morning when he overheard two neighbors whispering on the sidewalk. They didn't know he was nearby, and the conversation stopped abruptly when they saw him approach. But he had heard enough. One of them had mentioned how strange it was that Jack hadn't even bothered to introduce himself to the community, and how suspicious his car had looked sitting in his parents' driveway. Karen had already begun her campaign of lies. She was telling anyone who would listen that Jack was a criminal, that he was using his FBI identity to spy on the neighborhood. To her, this wasn't just about her authority being challenged, it was about destroying Jack's reputation and turning the neighborhood against him. She even claimed that Jack had been involved in shady activities under the guise of a federal agent. The whispers spread like wildfire. Karen was relentless in spreading misinformation, going door to door to ensure that everyone believed her version of events. She posted exaggerated warnings about Jack on the neighborhood's social media group, painting him as a dangerous criminal. She made up stories about him being involved in illegal activity, claiming he had been using his position as an FBI agent to intimidate and control people. Slowly, Karen poisoned the well, convincing neighbors to keep their distance and to avoid any further contact with Jack. At first, it seemed like nothing more than idle gossip. But the more Karen spread her lies, the more Jack began to notice the subtle shift in how people treated him. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now looked away or avoided eye contact when he passed by. Even a few of the families who had been friendly with him before began to distance themselves, clearly influenced by Karen's fabricated stories. One evening, as Jack returned from the store, he found his car covered in flyers, disturbing, baseless accusations about his character. FBI agent? More like a criminal in disguise, one of the flyers read. Another one included a photo of Jack's government-issued vehicle, with "suspicious" written in bold, red letters across it. The flyers were strategically placed all over the neighborhood, on lampposts, mailboxes, and even in the windows of some of the homes. It hit him hard. For the first time in his life, he felt like an outsider in the place he had once called home. His own neighbors were turning on him, influenced by Karen's relentless campaign of slander. Karen had cleverly managed to create doubt in their minds, using the same tactics she had used for years to manipulate everyone around her. But this time, her target was far more dangerous than anyone she had ever tried to control before. As if that wasn't enough, Karen escalated even further by trying to involve local authorities. She showed up at the police precinct one morning, demanding that they arrest Jack for being a suspicious character, and for endangering the neighborhood. She even went as far as to claim that Jack had illegally parked his government-issued vehicle without proper clearance, accusing him of breaking multiple laws. The officers at the precinct, clearly aware of her history of irrational complaints, initially laughed her off. But Karen wouldn't be deterred. She threatened to escalate the issue to city officials, to the mayor, and even to state authorities if necessary. She told them that Jack was part of a larger criminal conspiracy, and that the FBI agent was a threat to the entire neighborhood. Jack knew that things were getting out of hand. His reputation was being systematically destroyed by a woman who had nothing better to do than to control every aspect of the neighborhood. She had successfully turned people against him, and now she was pulling every string she could to make sure he'd never be able to live here again. It was no longer just about personal vendettas. Karen had made him the villain in her own little fantasy world. But as Jack stood there, facing the full extent of Karen's malicious actions, a fire sparked within him. He couldn't let her get away with this. He had to fight back, not just for himself but for every neighbor who had been affected by her lies and manipulation. Karen had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated him, and it was time for her reign of terror to end. One evening, Jack gathered his thoughts and prepared to confront Karen once more. He had no intention of letting her continue to poison the community, and he knew the only way to stop her was to take the fight to her. It was time to expose her for what she truly was. This wasn't just about protecting his reputation, it was about standing up to someone who had used their power for far too long. The real battle was just beginning. The final confrontation with Karen was inevitable. After weeks of relentless lies, rumors, and manipulation, Jack was determined to put an end to the chaos she had stirred. He knew that Karen was desperate and that her actions were no longer just a nuisance, they were dangerous. The power she had built within the neighborhood had reached its peak, and now it was time to bring her down. Jack wasn't going to let her destroy his life or the lives of others any longer. Armed with the evidence he had gathered, Jack decided it was time to act. He went to the police station to meet with the chief, who had already been briefed about Karen's escalating behavior. The chief was aware of the damage Karen had done to the neighborhood and was ready to back Jack up. It wasn't just about Jack anymore, it was about stopping someone who had turned an entire community upside down with her unchecked authority. With the support of the chief and several officers, Jack visited Karen's house one evening. He could see her standing in the window, probably plotting her next move, unaware that the end of her reign was drawing near. Jack knocked on her door, and when she answered, the smug expression on her face quickly shifted to one of confusion as she saw the officers standing behind him. "Karen Thompson, you're under arrest," Jack said calmly, holding up the arrest warrant. Her eyes went wide with disbelief, and she took a step back. "No, this isn't happening," she shrieked. "I've done nothing wrong. This is a conspiracy. I'm being targeted." But it was too late. The officers moved in, handcuffing her and escorting her out of the house. Karen protested, yelling about how she would take down Jack, the neighborhood, and even the police department with her, but it was clear that her game was over. Her operation had crumbled in an instant, and all the lies she had spun to keep control over the neighborhood had unraveled. As the police car drove off with Karen, neighbors peeked out of their windows, some of them quietly cheering, others in shock. The terror that had gripped the community for so long was finally over, and the air in the neighborhood felt lighter, almost as if a weight had been lifted. Jack took a deep breath, feeling a sense of justice wash over him. He had exposed Karen for what she was, a power-hungry manipulator who would stop at nothing to control others. Her arrest wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood that had lived under her thumb for far too long. As Jack walked back to his parents' house, he couldn't help but think about the damage one person could cause when given too much power. Karen had tried to break him, but in the end, she had only revealed her own corruption. But the real question remained, how many more neighborhoods are out there where people like Karen are pulling the strings, hiding behind authority and abusing power? Have you ever faced someone like Karen in your community? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.